I was tired. That was the only explanation I had for what happened that Tuesday evening. I'd been putting in long hours at the office, the kind of week where your eyes feel like they've been rubbed with sandpaper and your thoughts move through molasses. I pulled into the driveway of my suburban home, the headlights of my sedan cutting across the manicured lawn before I killed the engine. The silence of the neighborhood settled around me. Crickets chirping in the azalea bushes, the distant hum of the highway, the occasional dog barking 2 streets over. It was a normal night, a boring night. I unbuckled my seatbelt. I reached for the door handle. I pushed it open. But before the door even moved, before the latch clicked, I heard the sound of the door opening. It was a distinct metallic clunk of the mechanism releasing, followed immediately by the heavy thud of the door swinging open and hitting the rubber stop. I froze. My hand was still on the handle. The door was closed. I sat there for a moment, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I looked at the door. It was shut tight. I looked at my hand. I was gripping the handle, but I hadn't pulled it yet. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, you're exhausted." I pulled the handle. The door opened. It made the exact same sound. Clunk. Thud. I stepped out into the cool air. I locked the car with the key fob. Beep, beep. I heard the beep before my thumb pressed the button. I looked at the fob in my hand. My thumb was hovering over the lock symbol. I hadn't pressed it down. The sound had already happened. It was like the universe was buffering, loading the audio track a split second before the video caught up. I walked up the sidewalk to the front door, the gravel crunching under my shoes. I reached into my pocket for my keys. My fingers brushed the cold metal. I pulled them out. I heard the key scrape against the lock. I stopped. My keys were in my hand, but they were a foot away from the deadbolt. The sound of metal scraping metal had already echoed in the quiet porch air. I stood there, staring at the lock. The hair on my arms stood up. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. I looked around the porch. Nothing. Just the swing set, swaying gently in the breeze in the backyard, the glow of the motion sensor light from the neighbor's garage. "Don't be stupid," I said aloud. My voice sounded shaky. "It's an echo. The acoustics on this porch are weird." I put the key in the lock. I turned it. The lock clicked. I opened the door and went inside. The house was dark, save for the green glow of the microwave clock in the kitchen and the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I tossed my keys on the entry table. They hit the wood. Clatter. They hit the wood. That was normal. I walked into the kitchen. I needed a glass of water. My throat felt parched, scratchy. I reached for the cabinet door to get a glass. Creak. The hinge whined, the sound of the door opening. But my hand was still 6 inches away. I hadn't even touched the handle yet. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I stared at the cabinet. It was closed. I waited. I reached out again. This time, I moved agonizingly, slow. I watched the gap between my fingers and the wood handle. 2 inches, 1 inch, creak. The sound came again. It was perfect. Identical to the sound a wooden hinge makes when it hasn't been oiled in 3 years. It happened the instant my hand crossed the threshold of the cabinet's personal space before contact was made. I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. The creak didn't repeat. It had already played. I grabbed a glass. I filled it at the sink. The water was cold. I drank it in one long gulp, the cold liquid shocking my system. I set the glass down. Clink. The glass hit the counter. I looked at the glass. It was still in my hand. I was holding it an inch above the counter. I dropped it. I didn't want to hold it anymore. I just let it fall. smash. It shattered on the floor. Water and shards of glass sprayed across the linoleum. But the sound of it breaking, had happened a split second before it actually hit the floor. I heard the crash, and then I watched it break. I backed away, stepping carefully around the puddle. I bumped into the kitchen island. "Stop it," I said. "Just stop." I went into the living room and sat on the couch. I turned on the lamp beside me. Click. The lamp turned on, but I realized I had heard the click before the room lit up. The sound had preceded the light. I sat on the edge of the cushion, my hands gripping my knees. I was a rational person. I was an accountant. I dealt in facts and figures. There was always a logical explanation. Audio hallucinations could be caused by stress or sleep deprivation. Temporal lobe seizures could cause déjà vu. I was probably having a mild stroke. That was a comforting thought. A stroke was medical. It was biological. It wasn't this. I decided to go to bed. Sleep was the answer. If I slept, I would reset. I walked to the hallway. The light switch was on the wall. I reached for it. Click. The hallway light turned on before I flipped the switch. My finger was still hovering over the plastic toggle. I flipped it anyway. Nothing happened. The light was already on. I walked down the hall to the bathroom. I brushed my teeth. I looked in the mirror. My face looked pale, drawn, dark circles under my eyes. I rinsed my mouth. I spat into the sink. Spit. The sound of the fluid hitting the porcelain arrived in my ears a fraction of a second before I actually spit. I gripped the edges of the sink. I stared at my reflection. "You're not doing this," I whispered. "I'm not doing this." I heard the whisper. "I'm not doing this." But my lips hadn't moved until after the sound. I went into the bedroom. I got into bed. I pulled the covers up to my chin. I closed my eyes. I lay there for a long time. The house was silent. But the silence wasn't empty. It felt like it was holding its breath, like the air was waiting for me to make a move so it could react to it in advance. I thought about getting up to check the front door. I just thought about it. I visualized walking down the hall, turning the lock. Click! I heard the deadbolt turn. My eyes snapped open. I sat up in bed. I looked at the bedroom door. It was closed. I lay back down. I tried to empty my mind. I tried to think of nothing, black void, static. Then I thought about the lamp in the living room. I imagined myself walking out there and turning it off. Click. From the living room, I heard the lamp turn off. I stopped breathing. The darkness in the house seemed to deepen, to press in on the bedroom. It wasn't just reacting to me. It was reading my mind. It was anticipating my inputs. It was rendering the world around me based on what I was about to do, not what I was doing. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling. I didn't move. I didn't think. I tried to be as still as possible. If I didn't think, if I didn't act, there would be no sound. There would be no event to anticipate. The sun came up eventually. The light filtered through the blinds, gray and weak. I got out of bed. I was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that made my limbs feel heavy. I walked into the kitchen. The glass was still shattered on the floor. I stepped over it. I made coffee. I needed caffeine. I stood by the counter, watching the coffee maker drip, 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 drip. I decided to go to the bathroom, flush. I heard the toilet flush in the bathroom. I hadn't moved. I was standing in the kitchen. The house was getting faster. The anticipation gap was widening. It wasn't just predicting the next second. It was predicting the next minute. I poured the coffee. I drank it black. It burned my tongue. I decided to go to work. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to be around people. I needed noise, real noise, chaos that wasn't synchronized with my brain. I went to the closet to get my coat. I reached for the doorknob of the closet. Creak. The door opened before I touched it. I grabbed my coat. I put it on. I decided to grab my umbrella. It looked like rain. I turned toward the umbrella stand by the door. Clatter. The umbrella fell over. It hit the floor. I watched it fall. I heard it hit the floor. I picked it up. I didn't look at it. I just grabbed it. I opened the front door. The screen door was already open. I stepped out onto the porch. I walked to my car. I heard the engine start before I turned the key. I got in. I drove. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want to hear any sound that might happen before I made it happen. I drove to the office. I parked in the garage. I took the elevator. I stood in the elevator, watching the numbers light up. Ding. The elevator dinged before the doors opened. I stepped out onto my floor. My coworker, Sarah, was walking by. She looked at me. "Morning," she said. I heard her say, "Morning," before her mouth moved. I stopped. I looked at her. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to smile. "Just tired." I heard myself say, "Just tired," before I spoke the words. Sarah looked at me strangely. She walked away. I sat at my desk. I turned on my computer. Whir. The computer started up before I pressed the power button. I logged in. I stared at the spreadsheets. I tried to work. But every time I went to type a number, I heard the clack of the keyboard before my fingers hit the keys. Clack, clack, clack. I typed the numbers. They appeared on the screen. I sat there for hours. The noise of the office, phones ringing, people talking, printers whirring. It all became a jumbled mess of audiovisual desynchronization. I heard the phone ring, saw the light blink, and then picked up the receiver, only to realize the ring had happened 3 seconds ago. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't exist in a world that was always one step ahead of me. I decided to go home early. I couldn't work. I couldn't function. I drove home. The sun was setting. The sky was a bruised purple. I parked in the driveway. I sat in the car for a long time. I didn't want to go inside. The house was the center of it. The house was where the lag was the worst, but I had nowhere else to go. I got out of the car. I walked to the door. I decided I would check the mail. I walked to the mailbox. I opened it. It was empty. I closed it. I turned toward the house. The front door was open. I knew I had closed it. This morning, I knew it. But it was open. Wide open. I walked toward it. I stepped onto the porch. I heard footsteps inside the house, heavy boots on the hardwood floor. I stopped. I gripped my umbrella like a weapon. The footsteps stopped. I decided to step inside. Creak. The floorboard creaked under my weight before I put my foot down. I walked into the hallway. "Hello?" I said. I heard the word, "hello," echo back to me from the living room. But it wasn't an echo. It was my voice, but it was coming from a different direction. I walked into the living room. It was empty. The furniture was in its place. The TV was off. But the room felt wrong. It felt like a set, like a stage that had been set up for a play that hadn't started yet. I stood in the middle of the room. "Show yourself," I whispered. I heard the whisper, "Show yourself," come from the corner of the room. I turned, nothing there. I realized then what was happening. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was the environment, the house, the world. It was loading the events of my life before I lived them. It was buffering my reality. and the buffer was getting longer. I decided to sit on the couch. I heard the springs of the couch compress before I sat down. I sat. I decided to turn on the TV. Click, the TV turned on. Static filled the screen. White noise. Hiss. I stared at the static. I decided to turn it off. Click. It turned off. I sat in the silence. Then I had a thought, a terrifying thought. What if I decided not to do something? What if I decided to pick up the remote and then didn't? I looked at the remote on the coffee table. I decided to pick it up. I heard the rustle of the fabric of the couch as I leaned forward. I heard the sound of my hand grasping the plastic, but I didn't move. I forced my body to stay still. I planted my feet on the floor. I locked my muscles. The sounds continued. I heard the rustle. I heard the clatter of the remote being picked up. I watched the remote. It didn't move. It sat on the table. The sounds happened anyway. The house was playing the track of me picking up the remote, even though I was refusing to do it. I felt a wave of nausea. The reality of the situation crashed over me. I wasn't the one making the choices. I was just the output. I was the character in a movie that had already been edited. My thoughts were just subtitles, appearing after the scene had already been filmed. I decided to stand up and run out the door. I heard the front door slam shut. I was still sitting on the couch. I heard the engine of my car start. I was still sitting on the couch. I heard the screech of tires as I drove away. I was still sitting on the couch. I couldn't move. I was frozen. I was just a thought, a concept, a piece of data being processed. The room began to dim. The edges of my vision started to blur. The coffee table lost its texture. The carpet became a smear of beige. The lag was disappearing. The anticipation was perfecting. I heard a voice. Not my voice. A flat, neutral voice. A system voice. User disconnection detected, the voice said. Rolling back, changes. I heard the front door open again. I heard myself walk in. I heard myself drop the keys. I heard myself sit on the couch. I watched the room reset. The shadows retreated. The textures sharpened. I was sitting on the couch. I was holding the remote. I didn't remember picking it up. I looked at the TV. It was on, static. I looked at my hand. I was pressing the power button. Click. The TV turned off. I sat there. I felt better. The fatigue was gone. The confusion was gone. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I got a glass of water. I didn't hear the sound before I made it. The glass hit the counter exactly when I set it down. I smiled. Everything was in sync. I walked back to the living room. I looked at the front door. It was closed. I decided to go to the kitchen to make dinner. I heard my footsteps on the floor before I took a step. I stopped. I looked at my feet. I tried not to move. The footsteps continued. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. They were walking toward the kitchen. My body was still sitting on the couch. I watched myself walk away. The office building where I work is a glass monolith in the downtown district. 42 stories of steel and polished granite that reflects the sky so perfectly. It's hard to tell where the building ends and the clouds begin. I work on the 32nd floor, in data entry. It's a mundane job, repetitive, requiring very little thought. I like that. I like the rhythm of it. I like the predictability. But lately the predictability has become aggressive. It's not just that things stay the same, it's that they refuse to change. It started on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk, typing in figures from a physical ledger into the digital system. I had a mug of coffee, black 2 sugars, sitting on a coaster to my right. I reached for it without looking, my eyes on the column of numbers. My hand hit the mug. It tipped over. I saw it happen in slow motion. The ceramic rotated. The dark liquid arced out of the rim, splashing onto the white desk blotter. It was going to soak into the papers I had just printed. It was going to be a disaster. I stood up, knocking my chair back, reaching for a napkin, a towel, anything to stop the mess. My fingers grazed the arm of my chair. I froze. I looked down. The mug was upright. It was sitting perfectly on the coaster. The coffee was steaming gently, the liquid level exactly 3/4 full. There was no spill. There were no wet papers. The desk was dry and pristine. I stood there, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked around the cubicle farm. No one was looking at me. Everyone was typing. The hum of the servers and the air conditioning was a constant, low-frequency drone. I looked back at the mug. I was sure I had knocked it over. I had felt the weight shift in my hand. I had seen the liquid leave the cup. I sat back down slowly. I looked at my hand. It was trembling. I decided it was a hallucination, a micro-sleep, a lapse in concentration. I was tired. I hadn't slept well the night before. I picked up the mug. I took a sip. It was hot. I went back to work. An hour later, I needed to use the restroom. I stood up and walked down the long corridor to the elevators. The floor was carpeted in a tight geometric pattern of gray and blue. I counted the tiles as I walked, a nervous habit I'd had since childhood. 1, 2, 3. I reached the restroom. I went inside, washed my hands, looked in the mirror. My face looked pale, dark circles under my eyes. I dried my hands and walked out. I started back to my desk. 1, 2, 3. I stopped. I looked at the floor. I looked at the door to the supply closet I had just passed. The tile pattern was different. The blue squares were smaller. I turned around. I walked back to the restroom. I counted the tiles again. 10 tiles. I walked back toward my desk. 5 tiles. The distance had shortened. The hallway had compressed. I knew the length of this hallway. I walked it 4 times a day. It was 20 paces long. It was now 10 paces long. I leaned against the wall, feeling the cold drywall through my dress shirt. I felt a wave of nausea. I looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights were buzzing, but the sound was skipping, like a scratched CD buzz click. I pushed off the wall and walked the remaining 5 steps to my cubicle. Mark, the guy in the next cubicle over, was standing by my desk. He was holding a file. "Hey," he said, "did you finish the Q3 report?" I looked at him. "I'm working on it, Mark." "Okay, great," he said. "Just need it by noon." He turned and walked away. I sat down at my desk. I looked at the clock on my computer screen. 11:58 a.m. I opened the file for the Q3 report. I started typing. 2 minutes later, Mark walked by again. "Hey," he said, "did you finish the Q3 report?" I looked up. My blood ran cold. "I'm working on it, Mark," I said. "Okay, great," he said. "Just need it by noon." He turned and walked away. I looked at the clock. 11:58 a.m. I had just had this conversation. I had just heard those words. He had just walked away. I stood up and looked over the partition. Mark was sitting at his desk. He was typing. "Mark," I said. He didn't look up. "Hey," he said, "did you finish the Q3 report?" "No," I said, my voice rising. "We just talked about this." Mark looked up then. He frowned. His expression was blank, confused. He looked right through me, as if he didn't recognize me, or as if I were a piece of furniture. "Okay," he said. just need it by noon. He went back to typing. I sat back down. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't type. The realization was settling over me like a heavy blanket. The environment was correcting. It was reverting to a default state. If I had a conversation and the system didn't like the outcome, it would reset the conversation. If I spilled coffee and the system didn't want a mess, it would unspill it. If I walked down a hall and the system wanted to save rendering power, it would shorten the hall. I was living in an autocorrect for reality. I needed to test it. I needed to create a change that was undeniable. A change that couldn't just be smoothed over or forgotten. I took a pen from my desk. It was a cheap ballpoint, black ink. I pressed the tip hard against the mahogany laminate of the desk. I carved a deep groove into the wood. I am here. I gouged the letters deep. I saw the curl of wood shavings. I felt the resistance of the material. I sat back and looked at it. I am here. It was ugly. It was vandalism. It was permanent. I picked up a stapler. I slammed it onto the desk. Wham! The sound echoed in the cubicle. I threw the stapler against the partition. It clattered to the floor on the other side. I waited. I watched the desk. I watched the groove in the wood. For a moment, nothing happened. The groove sat there, dark and jagged. The stapler lay on the floor. Then the air shimmered. It was a heat haze distortion, like the air above a road on a hot day. The humming sound of the lights spiked in pitch. I looked at the groove. It was filling in. The wood wasn't growing. The groove was just vanishing. The dark shavings flowed backward, reattaching themselves to the surface, blending in. The color of the wood deepened, smoothing out the gouge. In less than a second, the desk was pristine. I looked over the partition. The stapler was back on my desk. I sat there, staring at my hands. I was the error. I was the anomaly. The world was trying to optimize itself, and I was introducing entropy. I was making noise. I was making messes. I was taking up space that the system hadn't allocated for me. I decided to leave. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out. I needed to go somewhere chaotic, somewhere the system couldn't control everything. A crowded street, a busy park. I grabbed my coat. I walked to the elevators. I pressed the down button. The arrow lit up. Ding! The doors opened. I stepped inside. I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. The elevator didn't move. I watched the numbers above the door. They were stuck on 32. I pressed the button again, hard, nothing. I pressed the button for the ground floor. I pressed the button for the parking garage. I pressed every button. Nothing. The elevator was a metal box. It was paused. Then the display changed. It didn't show a number. It showed a loading bar. A thin red line appeared on the black screen. It was filling up, pixel by pixel. Loading. I felt the floor vibrate. The box was shifting, but not physically. It was shifting dimensionally. The walls were breathing in and out. The loading bar filled 100%. The doors opened. I wasn't in the lobby. I was on the 32nd floor. I stepped out. The hallway was different. It was shorter, much shorter. My desk was right there. I could reach out and touch it from the elevator door. I turned around. The elevator doors closed. The button panel was gone. It was just smooth metal. I was trapped in a loop of the office floor. The world had compressed the building to save memory. It had deleted the stairs. It had deleted the lobby. It had deleted the outside. I walked to my desk. I sat down. Mark was standing there. "Hey," he said, "did you finish the Q3 report?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him. I looked at his face. It was smooth, too smooth. The pores on his skin were gone. His eyes were glass. "Mark," I whispered, "you aren't real." He didn't blink. "Okay," he said. "Just need it by noon." I looked at my computer screen. The cursor was blinking. Blink, blink. I decided to write something. I decided to type a message to the system, to whoever was watching. I placed my fingers on the keyboard. "I am real." I looked at the screen. The words appeared. Then they backspaced, one by one. LAERMAI. The screen was blank. I tried again. I typed faster. "Let me out. Delete, delete, delete." I slammed my fists on the keyboard. "I am here, I am here, I am here." The keyboard went dead. The screen went black. I looked at my hands. My fingers were blurring. The edges of my skin were becoming indistinct, like a low-resolution image. I stood up. I tried to run. I tried to run toward the window, to break the glass, to shatter the simulation. I took one step. My leg didn't move. It was stuck. I tried to lift my foot. It wouldn't separate from the floor. The carpet had fused with my shoe. I looked down. The pattern of the carpet was creeping up my leg. The geometric blue and gray tiles were dissolving my pants, turning them into texture. I fell forward. I caught myself on the desk. But my hands sank into the wood. It wasn't wood anymore. It was plastic. It was hard, cold plastic. I looked around the room. Everything was plastic. Everything was a set. Mark was looking at me. "Subject 452 is destabilizing," he said. His voice was different now, synthetic, electronic. "Recalibrating." I tried to scream. I opened my mouth. "No sound," Mark said. "Audio disabled." My vocal cords vibrated, but no sound came out. The air absorbed the noise instantly. I felt a pulling sensation. It wasn't pulling me toward anything. It was pulling me apart. I was being unrendered. The atoms in my body were losing their bond to one another. I looked at my hand. It was dissolving into pixels, into bits of data. I wasn't dying. I was being archived. "You are clutter," Mark said. He was no longer standing. He was hovering, a wireframe model of a man, glowing green against the gray void of the office. "You are unnecessary data." The room began to dissolve. The walls faded to black. The ceiling vanished. I was floating in nothingness. Then a white light appeared. A cursor. "Delete?" Y/N. I watched the cursor blink. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only watch. The cursor moved to Y. Click. I felt a sensation of peace. A heavy, blank peace. The fear was deleted. The memories were deleted. The ego was deleted. I was back at my desk. I was typing. I looked at the clock. 11:58 a.m. I looked at the screen. I was entering data. The numbers flowed from my fingers. They were perfect. No errors. No corrections. Mark walked by. "Hey," he said. "Did you finish the Q3 report?" I smiled. My face felt smooth. I felt efficient. "Just finished it, Mark," I said. "Great," he said. "Just need it by noon." I turned back to the screen. I was happy. I was optimized. I was part of the system now. I was the default state. And nothing would ever change again. The airport at 3 a.m. is a purgatory of white noise and fluorescent lighting. It's a place where time doesn't pass. It just accumulates, piling up like the snow outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was at gate B14, stranded due to a mechanical issue that the gate agent had announced with a voice so devoid of inflection it sounded robotic. I was the only one left at the gate. The other passengers had been rerouted hours ago, or had given up and gone to hotels. I was stubborn. I needed to get home. I was sitting in one of those rigid, interconnected seats, the kind that force you to look at the person next to you. but the seat next to me was empty. I stood up to pace. I needed to move. I needed to feel like I was doing something, even if it was just wearing down the carpet. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. It was dark outside, the tarmac a black void illuminated only by the blinking strobe lights of the grounded planes. I pressed my hand against the glass. It was cold. I decided to go to the vending machines at the end of the concourse. I needed water. My throat felt like it had been stuffed with cotton. I turned left and started walking. The concourse stretched out before me, a straight line of polished terrazzo floors and duty-free shops shuttered behind metal grates. The repeating arches of the ceiling created a tunnel effect. I walked. I passed a restroom. I passed a newsstand. I passed a charging station. I kept walking. I expected to reach the intersection for the A terminal. I knew the airport layout. I flew out of this hub twice a month. The intersection was 300 yards down. I walked 500 yards. The shops were repeating. I passed the same newsstand, the same magazines in the window, the same last-minute gifts sign with a peeling corner. I stopped. I turned around. I looked back the way I came. The gate was gone. The corridor stretched out in both directions, an infinite loop of shuttered stores and empty seating. "Okay," I said. My voice sounded flat, swallowed immediately by the acoustic tiles. Just follow the signs. I looked at the hanging signs suspended from the ceiling. To parking/transportation/ground transit. I followed the arrow. I walked faster. My footsteps echoed. Clack, clack, clack. But the sound was wrong. The echo was arriving too quickly. It was bouncing back to me before I had finished taking the step. I walked for a minute, then two. I passed the newsstand again. I stopped in front of it. I looked at the cover of a magazine. A celebrity was smiling, holding a glass of orange juice. I turned around and walked back the other way. 10 steps. I passed the newsstand again. The magazine was different. The celebrity was frowning. The headline was in a different language. I spun around, panic beginning to tighten my chest. I ran. I ran toward the gate I came from. Clack, clack, clack. I ran past the restroom. I ran past the charging station. The gate wasn't there. The corridor just continued. I skidded to a halt. I was breathing hard, my breath misting in the frigid air. I looked for an exit door, an emergency exit. There had to be one. I saw a green glowing sign down a side hallway. Exit. I ran toward it. I pushed the bar on the door. It didn't budge. It wasn't locked. It was solid. The bar didn't depress. It was painted onto the door. It was a trompe-l'oeil, a fake door painted on a solid wall. I slammed my fist against it. Thud. The sound was dull. The wall didn't vibrate. I backed away. I looked around. The side hallway was narrowing. The walls were moving, not visually, not sliding like a set piece, but the perspective was shifting. The ceiling felt lower. The fluorescent lights were closer together, brighter, hotter. I decided to scream. I opened my mouth. I filled my lungs. I pushed the air out. Nothing happened. My vocal cords vibrated. I felt the physical sensation of screaming in my throat. But the air didn't carry the sound. The silence absorbed it instantly. It was like being in a vacuum chamber. I tried again. I put my hands to my ears. I couldn't hear my own voice. I couldn't hear my breathing. The world had muted me. I turned back to the main concourse. I had to get back to the gate. Maybe the plane was still there. Maybe I could just get on the plane. I didn't care where it went. I started walking. The floor was changing. The terrazzo was becoming smooth, seamless. The grout lines were disappearing. The floor was a single sheet of white material. I walked. My shoes made no sound now. There was no friction. It felt like walking on ice, but I wasn't slipping. I was gliding. I saw a chair ahead, one of the rigid airport seats. I tried to walk around it. As I stepped to the left, the chair slid to the left. I stopped. The chair stopped. I stepped to the right. The chair slid to the right. It was blocking me. It was hurting me. I ran at it. I tried to jump over it. As my feet left the ground, the seat rose. It lifted up into the air, blocking my path. I collided with it, a dull impact against my shins. I fell forward onto the white floor. I scrambled up. I looked back. The chair was back on the ground. It was facing me. I turned and ran the other way. There was another chair, then another. A line of them was appearing, sliding out of the white walls, forming a barricade. I was being corralled. I turned toward a storefront. The metal grate was down. I grabbed it. I tried to pull it up. My hands slipped through the metal. It wasn't solid. It was a projection. It was a hologram. My hands passed through the metal mesh as if it were smoke. I pulled them back. They were unharmed. I hammered my fists against the glass of the store window. Thud, thud. The glass rippled like the surface of a pond. It didn't break. It just absorbed the kinetic energy. It was like hitting hard rubber. I backed away, my chest heaving in silent screams. I looked at my hands. The edges of my fingers were blurring. The skin tone was desaturating, turning gray. I looked down at the floor. The pattern on my shoes was fading. The logo was gone. The environment was optimizing me. I was too high resolution. I was using too much texture memory. It was simplifying my model. No, I thought. I am real. I thought the words, but I didn't hear the thought in my head. I just knew the concept. The internal monologue was becoming pure data. I ran to the window, the big floor-to-ceiling window that looked out onto the tarmac. If I could break the glass, I could get out. I could get on to the tarmac. I grabbed a metal garbage can. It was bolted to the floor. I pulled. The bolts screamed. They made sound and snapped. I lifted the heavy can. I swung it with all my strength at the window. It hit the glass. The garbage can dissolved. It didn't break. It didn't dent. It just disintegrated into a cloud of gray dust that hung in the air for a second and then was sucked into the ventilation grate. I stared at my hands. I was holding nothing. The window was pristine, not a scratch. I leaned my forehead against the glass. I looked outside. The tarmac was gone. There was no snow, no planes, no lights. There was just white, a blank, white void. I turned around. The airport was gone. I was standing in a white room, a cube. The walls were white. The floor was white. The ceiling was white. There was no source of light, yet I could see perfectly. In the center of the room was a single object. It was a chair, but it wasn't an airport chair. It was a simple wooden chair, straight-backed, uncomfortable. I didn't want to sit in it. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to run. The room was shrinking. The walls were moving in. I backed away from the chair. My back hit the wall. The wall pushed me, gently. It was soft, like a hand pressing on my spine. It guided me forward. I tried to dig my heels in. I tried to resist. The floor tilted. It slanted downward toward the chair. I slid. I couldn't get traction. I slid across the white surface until my legs hit the seat of the chair. The pressure on my back increased. The wall was pushing me down. I tried to stand. I tried to push against the seat. My legs wouldn't lock. They turned to jelly. They lost their structural integrity. I collapsed into the chair. The room stopped shrinking. I sat there. I tried to lift my arm. It was heavy. Incredibly heavy. It was as if the gravity in the room had increased tenfold. I looked at my hand. My fingers were fusing together. The thumb was melting into the index finger. The skin was smoothing out. I was becoming a lump. I wasn't in pain. I was just losing definition. I tried to think of my name, John. The thought appeared, but it carried no weight. It was just a label, a tag. I tried to think of my home, my house, the blue door. The image of the door appeared in my mind. Then it flickered. Then it vanished. The memory was deleted to clear cache. I tried to think of my mother's face. Error. I looked up. A face appeared in the white ceiling. It wasn't a human face. It was a face made of geometry, a smooth oval plane with 2 indentations for eyes and a line for a mouth. It looked at me. Variation detected, the face said. The sound didn't come from a mouth. It resonated directly in my bones. Pruning. I felt a sensation of being compressed, like a zip file being squeezed. The room got smaller. The walls were inches from my nose. I tried to close my eyes, but my eyelids were gone. I couldn't look away. Optimizing, the face said. I felt my thoughts slowing down. The fear went away. The panic went away. Those were high-energy emotions. They were inefficient. They were being stripped away. I felt peaceful. I felt aligned. I looked at the chair. I was the chair. The chair was me. We were the same object. I looked at the wall. I was the wall. I was the room. I was the space. The face in the ceiling faded. The white light intensified. I wasn't trapped anymore. I was just present. I sat in the chair, perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly optimized, waiting for the next render cycle to begin. The room was empty. The room was full. I was the error, and the error was fixed.